things you could have been doing this evening, which maybe by the end you'll think would have been a better idea. But it's a great pleasure to be here and to see you all. And since this is my first visit to the Barnes Club since January the 6th, I wanted to start by saying a word or two about the lady who is the reason why I'm here at all. It was Barbie who first got in touch with me and invited me to come and talk, give a talk to the Barnes Philosophical Club. I think that was back in the days when you met in the Coach and Horses. I'm not sure where it was. Simeon just passed by whilst Paul, Fletcher and I were having a quick bit of pizza before I came here to do this. And Simeon has very kindly, very touchingly, given me a copy of his eulogy for Barbie from her memorial service. And Simeon closes with a few gratitude stones from the Mountain of Memories, which includes Barbie with my wonderful 90-something Aunt Pat in her grand drawing room in her very grand house in Westminster. And Barbie talking, as one does in such a grand setting, about nail polish and nail nature. And I have 2 stones of my own to add to the Mountain of Memory for Barbie. And one is driving across the Keswick Bridge on my way to go climbing a mountain in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland. Do you know where the Keswick Bridge is? It's the Moray Firth at Inverness. It's that rather spectacular bridge. If you go north on the A9 forever and ever and ever, you get to Perth. And if you keep going, eventually you get to Inverness. And if you keep going from there, you get to the Northwest Highlands. And I was driving across the Keswick Bridge on my way to go up, I forget which mountain, I think possibly Amchalik. And I was listening as I drove to one of Barbie's CDs, Grandma's Hands. And I'll always remember that song from there. And the other memory is of a previous occasion when I gave a paper here, and I did what I do sometimes. I decided to cycle to Barnes from King's Cross. And this normally goes well, but I was riding a folding bike, and the wheels were very small. It's a very pathetic sort of bike, really, and I got a bit lost. And I arrived at Barbie's, a couple of hours later, I think. And Barbie managed to convey to me quite how irritated she was at this behaviour, whilst being awfully nice about it. It was quite the combination. I was duly repentant, and never came on a bicycle again. So, the people we love have stories that we tell about them, and happy memories. And there have been some philosophers who thought that story is what ethics is all about. And I want to say a little bit about these ideas tonight. And just to frighten you, you can probably see on the screen down in the corner, it says page 1 of 22. This is a 22-page essay, but don't worry. I'm not going to read it out in a low monotone like one of those PowerPoint presentations where through all power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. I'm not going to do that, but I want to try and think about this idea. I want to try and show some of the places where it comes from, why people have wanted to talk about narrativity and ethics. And as I say in the abstract to this paper, I want to do something dialectical, which is a philosopher's fancy way of saying I want to have it both ways. It's an idea that comes from Plato via Hegel, the idea of dialectic. You take 2 positions, you oppose them, you get what's right about the 2 positions, and you move beyond them both to something that includes the best of both of them and rejects what's wrong in both of them. So, to put it pretentiously, I'm going to move dialectically. To put it unpretentiously, I'm going to try and have at least some things both ways. So, why might we think that narrative is a good way to understand ethics? Why might we start from that point? The answer to that question I think takes us back at least to Aristotle. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Aristotle to start with. I'm planning, by the way, to stop at about 20 past. Does that sound right? Perfect. Okay. So there's a bit in the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle that people often find quite puzzling when they start ethics. I certainly did. And it's where Aristotle has this long discussion towards the end of Book 1 of whether someone can be harmed or benefited after they're dead, and whether we can have the word happy, eudaimon, applied to us properly until we're dead. And one of the main examples that Aristotle talks about to make this point is the example of Priam in the Trojan War. Priam, as you may know, was a fantastically rich king of a fantastically successful and wealthy kingdom somewhere near the Dardanelles, and all was going swimmingly for Priam. He had human flourishing, as we call it. The story of his life was going very nicely, and then something disastrous happened. One of Priam's sons, Paris, fell in love with the wife of a Greek warrior, Menelaus, and eloped with her, ran away with her, with Helen's consent. And Menelaus came after her, and the whole Greek army came after her, and the result was the 10 years of the Trojan War, for the sake of a woman, says Aeschylus disgustedly. We went to all this trouble just for a woman. And in the Iliad, Homer says, Iliad has Achilles say to Agamemnon, two of the Greek generals who argue, I think it would be better if I just shot her right at the beginning, and we wouldn't have had all this trouble. That's not actually Helen, that's a different woman, that's a slave girl, the two of them are fighting over. So Barbie would have hated all this sexism, and so, to be clear, do I. But I'm getting distracted from the point I want to make, which is not about the dreadful sexism of the Greek tradition, and how a lot of the time the Greek tradition is not about what people call the gender binary these days, man-woman, two exclusive and exhaustive categories. It's about the gender unary. The only thing there really are is men, and women are just a degenerate case of men. Women don't even count. It's not a gender binary, because women, they're just failed men. Imagine how a transgender person feels about that. Anyway, end of sidebar rant. The point that I was wanting to make is that these shenanigans involving Helen cost Priam his happiness and cost him his life. And what happens at the end of Priam's life gives a quite different shape to the story of his life. And so Aristotle, when he's talking about whether a life can be judged happy before it's over, when Aristotle's talking about that, he's thinking about cases like Priam, where we seem to have a narrative which is going really well, and then suddenly something disastrous happens, and the story changes its meaning. And for Aristotle, I argue, I've just translated book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. For Aristotle, I argue in the footnotes to that translation, it's on Academia Edu, if you're interested. I argue in the footnotes to that translation that for Aristotle, eudaimonia is what I call a verdictive notion. And to understand what a verdictive notion is, think about the Psalms, if you know the Psalms at all. Psalm 1 begins, happy is the man who does not walk in the ways of wickedness, but trusts in the Lord. Happy, in that sentence, I don't know enough Hebrew to know what the Hebrew word is there, but that is the verdictive sense of happiness. If you can look at someone's life and pass the verdict, happy, on that life, then it was a happy life, in what Aristotle thinks is the true sense of his word for happiness, eudaimon. You are eudaimon if your life evokes, calls for a positive verdict like that. If we look at someone's life and say, oh, happy Sophie, it's not a natural form of words anymore, but it's there in the Psalms, and it's there in the Greek poets. It's there in the Beatitudes too, incidentally, while we're talking about the Bible. Happy are those who hunger, happy are those who mourn, happy are the humble and the poor and the downtrodden. that kind of happiness. Jesus is saying there that our intuitions about what counts as a flourishing human life, according to him, they're actually upside down. Because according to Jesus, you're happy if God's favour rests on you, and God's favour rests not on the rich, not on the wealthy, not on the powerful, but on the downtrodden. So, for Aristotle, happiness is a verdictive notion. When you look at the life as a whole, if you're inclined to say, that was a happy life, that was a wonderful life, then the life counts as happy. And that, says Aristotle, is what we're really after. That's what really matters. That kind of happiness. Not other kinds of happiness that we often talk about. So people often say, I'm quite happy to be going after this Aristotelian hair, because this is important and relevant to what I want to say. You notice the cursor hasn't moved a single line yet. You're still stuck in the abstract. It's okay. I do know what I'm doing, honest. And I do want to start by setting up the notion of a narrative conception of the good by thinking about Aristotle. So there's a famous exchange in the Greek playwright Aristophanes, where they're having a drama competition in Hades, and whoever it is who's the lead character of The Frogs, wonderful play, one of the oldest things that's still actually funny. He goes down to Hades to find a playwright who is going to give us the right kind of drama. Aristophanes is very conservative. He thinks that drama should be morally educative and make good people out of us. And it's a competition between Aeschylus and Sophocles. And it's a competition between Aeschylus and Euripides. And Euripides begins his attempts to make a line by saying, a happy man was Oedipus at first, and Aeschylus intervenes. No, he wasn't happy even at the start. He was flourishing, but he wasn't happy, because right from the beginning, Oedipus' life was built upon a terrible lie. Oedipus, as you remember, is the man who Freud got all excited about, because in the myth, he kills his father and marries his mother. So when you say a happy man was Oedipus at first, you're saying that there he is, as king of Thebes, ruling over his kingdom. All seems to be going well for him, just as it is for Priam, but there's poison in the cup. There's something deeply, deeply wrong about Oedipus' whole situation. And when Euripides says, a happy man was Oedipus at first, and that's the opening line that he's proposing to roll out, and Aeschylus stops him, I think Aeschylus has got a good point in this comic set up between Aeschylus and Euripides in The Frogs of Aristophanes. And the good point is, you're not really happy if your whole situation, however flourishing it may be, however many, you know how utilitarians think that they can measure happiness in utils, like one of those electrical devices that I've got over there, you know, a level meter. So the utils are banking up nicely. You're full of hedons, they're hedons or utils, whatever you call them. The units of happiness are banking up, and things are looking great. You're in a high pleasure situation, or you're in a high money situation, or you're in a high life satisfaction situation. You can measure life satisfaction, happiness, utility in various ways by filling in questionnaires, by attaching neurons to people's heads, by looking at their bank accounts, by counting their friends. These are all ways in which you might try to do it. But the verdictive account of happiness says no, that doesn't work, because we need to know the shape of the life story that this person is living, and for all we know, there's some dreadful calamity around the corner, which we haven't got to yet. So every first-year undergraduate who has to study Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and this was me, for example, when I was an undergraduate, thinks, what's going on? Why are we talking about whether you can have a happy life, or whether you can know you've got a happy life, until you're dead? I mean, how paradoxical is that? I mean, when you're dead, and life is over, and either you've moved on to the afterlife, or you're just feeding the worms. But, you know, how can it be that you can't assess whether someone is really happy until they're dead? That doesn't even make sense. And then Aristotle goes on to talk about, can people be harmed after their death? The reason for both these questions being important to Aristotle is the same. It's because Aristotle is concerned with the shape of the life. And suppose that I am celebrated throughout my life, I'm celebrated at the end of my life for having discovered the cure for some terrible disease, discovering a new and more powerful COVID vaccine, which just stops COVID ever happening again, or curing the common cold. Can I be made unhappy after my death? Yes, says Aristotle, because it can turn out after my death that actually this whole thing was fraudulent. Or imagine you spent your whole life trying to work on phlogiston, the supposed chemical substance that people used to believe on. You get a Nobel Prize in the last year of your life for your work on phlogiston. And then 1 year after your death, people discover that phlogiston is actually a complete nonsense, it's a fraud, there's no such thing. Your life's work is now in ruins. Can your happiness be affected? Well, after you're dead, yes it can, because this kind of thing affects it. There you were, thinking that you built up a great scientific heritage to pass on to history with your work on phlogiston. The whole thing's a fraud. It's all gone. It's fallen apart. The modern philosopher Derek Parfit said towards the end of his life, he died a few years ago now, I think in about 2017, Derek Parfit said that if he had not solved the principal problems of ethics during his lifetime, then he would regard his life as wasted. That's what he was sitting there in All Souls College in Oxford to do. And if he didn't succeed in doing that, then his life was a failure. And sadly, I am myself someone who has contributed to the minor cottage industry of reviews which are, should we say, not entirely positive about Derek Parfit's last book, and find major problems with it and with the whole project that it's engaged in. And, you know, you feel bad about treading on someone's grave in this way, but yet it has to be done. So people have had for a long time these thoughts about narratives as key to the meaning of life. And I want to suggest there are important links to be got when we think about narratives between two topics which are often a bit housed off from each other. The topic of ethics, what's valuable in life, what we should act towards, what we should do, and things like duties and people suffering and virtues and all that kind of thing. What should we do is treated as a question of ethics, and it tends to be a bit housed off from the question, what's the meaning of life? We take that to be a separate question. Now, if we think about narratives, I want to suggest we can get some traction on both questions at the same time. Because we're thinking both about what makes life a good life, what makes life a morally worthwhile life, an ethically valuable life. We're thinking also about what are the kind of achievements in life that give life meaning. So it looks like a fruitful line of inquiry. And here's Susan Hurley. Hooray! We've got to my first quotation. Only 21 pages to go. Here's Susan Hurley expounding this view in one of the best books that people no longer read very much, Natural Reasons from 1986. Susan Hurley was someone who had the misfortune to die rather young. She was also a fellow of All Souls, and Natural Reasons is, I think, her philosophical masterpiece. And it is about a lot of things. One of the main things it's about is what she's talking about here. We're fragmented and we seek not to be. We seek personal coherence and integrity. We face conflicting values. Famous example from Sartre that you may know. Somebody has to decide whether he's going to stay at home during the Nazi occupation of Paris and look after his sick mother, who will probably die if he's not there to protect her, because she needs someone to forage for her to find food in the grim conditions of wartime Paris, where even the Parisians don't have functioning restaurants. If he goes away and fights for the Free French, which is his other alternative, he will be leaving her behind. If he doesn't go and fight for the Free French, then maybe he will be neglecting some important duty towards humanity in general. The moral imperative to defeat the Nazis when his country is occupied. That's not something you can look past. Values conflict. It's a very well-known and important fact about values, that they conflict. And different ethical systems seek different ways of making them not conflict, of rendering them coherent. So utilitarians, like I was saying before, they get out this is a very crude parody of utilitarianism. I say it only to give you the idea. Please don't walk away thinking that this is all there is to utilitarianism. I'm traditionally very unfair on utilitarianism, but even I think this is unfair. Anyway, to resolve the problem of conflicting values, the parody goes, you get out your hedonometers, your utilometers, you measure how much pleasure and happiness people are getting out of their values, and you tot up these things, and you see, well, so which choice for the young man would result in greater utility? If he goes and fights for the Free French, or if he stays with his aged mother? That's how we should decide, says Bentham, says John Stuart Mill, in some moods and not in others. I'm engaging in parody here, but it's just illustrative parody. A Kantian says, forget about value altogether, stop thinking about value, this isn't helping. Think about what your duty is. Think about what your universalizable duty is, what any rational person in your position would do. It's a kind of, Kantianism sometimes looks a bit like that test that some American evangelicals like to do. What would Jesus do? Only it's the perfectly rational person instead of Jesus. It's reason incarnate that is making the choices. And the choices that reason makes are choices that anyone can make in that situation. So Kant says we don't need to worry about value. We don't need to reconcile the values like utilitarians try and do. Just forget about value. Here's a third approach, and this is the one that Susan Hurley is talking about. We do try and reconcile conflicting values by making space for those different values in our lives. So we find a way of telling the story of our lives which enables us to have, in that life, adequate space both for the needs of an ailing mother in a tenement in Paris and also for the emergency that has struck my nation. And also de la patrie, we say to ourselves, it's time to go out there and to set our country free, and to set Germany free, for that matter, from this dreadful tyranny, this dreadful fascism, which has come on us. You find a way somehow of reconciling those values. And of course, the great objection to this is the realistic objection, that reconciliations of conflicting values just aren't always possible. Now, what do you do when you get to that point? Well, one thing you can do is what the utilitarian wants to do, which is to say, oh, there must always be an ethical solution to any problem. There has to be an ethical solution. So a theory that doesn't always give you some answer to a problem is a failed theory. That's one solution, as you can tell from my sarcastic tone of voice. That's not what I want to say. What I want to say is what people like Isaiah Berlin say, and Bernard Williams. Sometimes life is tragic. We do our best to make sense of our situation, but sometimes it's not possible to make sense. Anyway, Susan Hurley, I think, is sympathetic to this when she says personal coherence is fragile. I think that's the point she's making there. That we try to tell a story that makes sense of our lives, but it isn't always possible to escape from tragedy. The possibility of tragedy in the sense of uncompensated disaster of some kind coming into our lives, that possibility can't just be magicked away, and it can't be systematized away, Susan Hurley is saying, in the way that the utilitarian hopes. You can't do it by measuring the goods against each other. That way lies, well, in the end, a total alienation of yourself from all the problems that are worth caring about. Likewise for the Kantian, if we just stop thinking about the values that we're engaging with and try and ask ourselves simply the question, what action in this situation is universalizable? What action is such that I could do it, and any rational person could do it? So forget about values, just think about rational agency. That doesn't do it either. You have to face up to the fact that sometimes life is tragic. So those are the people who want to give us some kind of narrative to our lives. And now comes a sceptical note, with a quarter of an hour to go, because on the other side, there's a whole host of people who are saying, nonsense. I'm not a narrative. My life isn't a narrative. I don't try and make my life a narrative. I just don't live that way. What you're doing, these people say, is you're trying to impose your kind of subjective experience, your way of living, which is a fact about you, fair enough, if you say so. If you see your life as a story, that's fine for you, bully for you. I don't see my life as a story. And why should you impose your particular way of seeing the world upon me? And the person I'm going to talk about most as the proponent of this view, because he's so beautifully clear about it, is Galen Strawson. In case you're wondering, Galen Strawson is one of the sons, I think Peter Strawson had 4 sons, of Sir Peter Strawson, the famous Oxford philosopher of the 60s, who's best known perhaps for his essay Freedom and Resentment. The takeaway message of Freedom and Resentment is that we just live naturally with concepts like responsibility, guilt, resentment, and all of these concepts imply that when we're thinking about other people, we think that they could have done otherwise than they did. I resent it when Nick looks me full in the face on the bus and treads deliberately on my cords. I resent it because I know damn well that Nick didn't have to do that. There's a gratuitous piece of terrible behaviour from Nick, and you should be ashamed of yourself. And I resent this because he could have done otherwise. And this is a way of saying, this is Strawson's way of saying, that for us, the notion of responsibility, and therefore the notion of freedom, freedom of the will, is baked into the way we engage with each other and the way we see the world. That's another sidebar. I was wanting to talk about Galen Strawson, his son, not Peter Frederick Strawson, but his son, Galen Strawson. Galen Strawson has this wonderful essay, which I recommend, from 2004, in which he lays out all these possibilities and gives us some phenomenological reports of his own. He says, well, people say that life is a narrative. Here's my experience. I don't think my life is a narrative at all. There are bits of episodes in it which have a kind of narrativity, but my life isn't as a whole a narrative. That's just not how I conceive of myself. And if I'm like this, and actually I'm not a freak, says Galen Strawson, actually lots of people are like this, lots of people are narratives, then who are these arrogant buggers who come along and say narrativity is the key, and we have to be constructors of narratives within our lives, and that's the key to ethics and the key to meaning? That's just arrogant, Galen Strawson says. That's just imposing their partial experience on the rest of us. And Galen Strawson gives a list of people who talk that way, which I'll come to in a moment. But I want to notice that there are some real philosophical heavyweights, some of them Parisians, in Galen Strawson's corner on this issue. And the most, perhaps the most philosophically heavyweight of all of them is the Irish Parisian, Samuel Beckett. I found this rather wonderful quote from Beckett, Stories and Texts for Nothing, a book which I don't know at all apart from this quotation, I'll freely admit. The internet is a wonderful thing. You find all sorts of unconsidered trifles on the internet. No need of a story, says Beckett. A story is not compulsory, just a life. That's the mistake I made, one of the mistakes. To have wanted a story for myself, whereas life alone is enough. So go back to Priam. What Beckett is saying here is a life doesn't need to have a shape. It's not about a life having a shape. It's about lots of little particular experiences that you might have. It's about the sun on the corn. It's about the first taste of coffee in the morning. It's about a good, powerful backhand return in a game of tennis. It's about these moments. And I'm the author, for full disclosure, of a book called Epiphanies. And in the first chapter of Epiphanies, I put the question to people who are reading my book, what are the great small pleasures of life? What are the great small pleasures of life? And it's not at all my view that you can compose life just out of lots of little pleasant moments. But But I think it's a view that's out there and that needs to be taken seriously, and I think it's what Beckett's saying. So I actually put this question to my friends on Facebook. I said to my friends on Facebook, this is part of my research for writing Epiphanies. It's about the only bit of anything like questionnaire, psychological, quantitative research I've ever done in my whole life, because I don't do that kind of psychological stuff very much. And other philosophers undoubtedly look down their noses at me for not doing it. There are various ways in which philosophers throw shade on each other. One is to say, well, my books on ethics are full of science. And another way is to say, well, my books on ethics are full of Greek. I keep referring to Aristotle. You keep referring to Kahneman and Tversky. Bully for you and bully for me. Philosophy isn't all about one-upmanship and putting downs, but a surprising amount of it is. It's also true, of course, that philosophers have two good ways of terrifying other philosophers, and one is to drop into logical formalism and use logical symbols, and the other is to drop into Greek. And you'd be glad to know that apart from Word You Daimon, which you've already had, I would do neither today. Okay, so here are some people who think that we do live our lives as narratives. And I'm not going to read these out. I think this paper is available to members of the club, isn't it?
Can be.
Yes. Please do make it available. You'll see where the Strawson paper is. You'll see where my references are for these quotes. I'm too lazy and time is too short for me to give you the references now. That would be boring. But by all means, look them up and pursue them and read up on all this if you'd like to. So Oliver Sacks, each of us constructs and lives a narrative. This narrative is us, our identities. And Jerry Bruno, self is a perpetually rewritten story. We become the autobiographical narratives by which we tell about our lives. Daniel Dennett, we're all virtuoso novelists. Mario Schechtman, a person creates his identity only by forming an autobiographical narrative, a story of his life. We've made it to the second page. How about that? Charles Taylor, because we can't but orient ourselves to the good, and hence determine our place relative to it, and hence determine the direction of our lives, we must inescapably understand our lives in narrative form as a quest, and must see our lives in story. And Ricoeur, this is a long rhetorical question. When I'm teaching philosophy, I always tell my students, please don't write in rhetorical questions. Don't say, what could be true but P? If you want to say P, bloody well say P. Just say it. Don't put it in a rhetorical question. Anyway, here's Ricoeur writing in rhetorical questions. And I'm going to try, if you can see that well enough to follow this little exercise, I'm going to try and reframe this rhetorical question as a proposition. I'm going to try and get from what could it be but P to P with what Paul Ricoeur is saying as an example. So here we go. I think it's something like, a subject of action cannot give an ethical character to his or her own life taken as a whole, unless this life is gathered together in some way. And for that to occur, there has to be a narrative. I think that's what he means. And in turning it from what could it be but P to P, you know, it's not what grows in a garden in a pod, and it's not what you put in the loo before you flush either. P is just a single letter which stands for a proposition. When we're abbreviating propositions, we always label them as P. That's why I'm going on about P. So Ricoeur is saying that we need a narrative in order for our lives to make sense, and without making sense of our lives, they won't have an ethical character. Okay, so there are Strawson's witnesses for the idea of narrativity, and here are Strawson's witnesses against in support of his own anti-narrative episodic view, and he lists all these people. Again, I'm just going to say, by all means, make it a little project to pursue these names in this list. Michel de Montaigne, we have, I think, a Montaigne expert in the audience already, Paul Fletcher, but go and have a look at these people if you're interested in finding out about them. Bob Dylan is in this list, and we just seen that Sam Beckett should be in it too. Here's a quotation from Bob Dylan. We got to the bottom of page 2, amazing. And I often can't resist doing impressions of people when I read out their works, at least to a small extent, at least if I know what they sound like. When you ask somebody questions, you're asking them to a person who's long dead. You're asking them to a person who doesn't exist. I couldn't go back and find Bobby in a million years. Neither could you or anyone else on the face of the earth. He's gone. He doesn't exist. Bob Dylan's here. I'm only like another person who's being transfigured. Transfiguration is what allows you to crawl out from under the chaos and fly above it. That's from a Rolling Stone interview in 2012. And Dylan's making the point, which is certainly true when you look at his work, that in his time he's been many people. In his time he's been the troubadour of the hip, swinging 60s. In his time he's been the anguished poet of the 70s. In his time he's been the Bible-thumping evangelical of 1978. He's been the Zionist of Neighborhood Bully. He's been all those people and others too, and he's someone else now. Now he's a painter who lives somewhere in the backwoods of Minnesota and refuses to go and collect even Nobel Prizes for literature. So you've got these two sides, you've got these two oppositions, and I want to finish up my last 6 minutes by saying something about where I want to come down on this dispute between narrative ethics and anti-narrative ethics, and why. So, the first thing is that I think there are some very silly ways of doing narrative ethics, and I also think there are some very oppressive ways of using narratives in life. So a silly way of doing narrative ethics is you're facing some choice, and you ask yourself, well, what would be the way of going on here that would make my life the most coherent narrative? And then you work out what that is and you do that. Now that's okay if you're a good person, but it's time for a quotation from Breaking Bad. Page 9 even. You either run from things or you face them, Mr. White, Walter White. And what exactly does that mean, Jesse? Jesse Pinkman. I learned it in rehab. It's all about accepting who you really are. I accept who I am, Walter White. And who are you? Jesse Pinkman. I'm the bad guy. So, saying what would be coherent with my past narrative is not a very good idea if your past narrative is a terrible narrative. If you've been a terrible person up to now, that's no reason to carry on being a terrible person. That would give your life more coherence, but more coherence is precisely what your life doesn't need. If you want an older and different frame of reference, think about the last song sung by Fagin in Oliver. I'm a bad 'un, and a bad 'un I will stay, he sings in reviewing the situation, just before dancing off into the dusk with the Artful Dodger for a further life of crime, though presumably given his age, not a very long one. I'm a bad 'un, and a bad 'un I will stay. If narrative coherence is something that we ought to be promoting, then that's going to give us the conclusion, if we're not very careful, that we should be promoting narrative coherence, even when our lives have been terrible lives so far. I've been a KKK member. I've been a mafioso. I haven't really, it's all right. And I'm just going to carry on doing these things because that will promote my narrative coherence. That's just stupid. And in past iterations of this paper, I've called this stupid narrative ethics, or silly narrative ethics. So if you can't do that with the thought, what can you do with it? I mean, the thought about coherence. Well, I won't answer that yet, because I think there's more to be said on the other side. Here's a further thought about narrative coherence. Sometimes it's positively good if you don't have it. Another biblical example, the thief on the cross. This person, it says in the Gospel, deserved to be crucified. Now, I don't think anyone deserves to be crucified. I don't even believe in capital punishment, let alone that particularly gruesome form of capital punishment. But this person had lived the life of a thief and a bandit and possibly a cutter of throats and a murderer. He was a terrible person. He wound up on the cross, but the Gospel narrative says he repented at the last. He said, I have done terrible things, I've had a terrible life. Forgive me, he says to Jesus, the person next to him on the cross. His life has less narrative coherence for that, and a good thing too. and let me move right down, you will be amazed to see where I'm going now, because I am going, if I can just get my cursor to work, all the way to page 16. And this is from Kipling. And it's about someone whose life is a series of phases. Purun Das, he's called, and he's one of the, forgive the background, which is of course Kipling's imperialism, racism about Indians, although he himself, Kipling was Mowgli, he was a white kid who grew up speaking Urdu as his first language. Kipling was himself a cross between an Indian child and an English child. But Purun Das is someone who gives up all of his power as a member of the Indian Empire's civil service. He had been, as the old law recommends, Kipling writes, and I forgive Kipling his terribly politically incorrect attitudes because he's such a great writer. He had been, as the old law recommends, 20 years a youth, 20 years a fighter, though he'd never carried a weapon in his life, 20 years head of a household. He used his wealth and his power for what he knew both to be worth. He'd taken honour when it came his way. He'd seen men in cities far and near, and men in cities had stood up and honoured him. Now he would let those things go, as a man drops the cloak he no longer leads. So he becomes a sannyasi. He becomes a Hindu ascetic, living in a cave in the mountains of Himachal Pradesh, and he puts behind him all that life that he had led as a hero of the British Raj. I think there are good lives which are divided in that kind of way, and I think they're none the worse for being so divided. And sometimes they might even be better. So the other thing I wanted to say, I keep on thinking there's a sweet corn pot on the floor. There's actually the spot from this microphone, which I keep knocking off. By being over vivacious, stop being so vivacious, Sophie. Be more boring. I can't get it on.
No, don't worry, it's not affecting the sound. We can.
Well, that's the main thing.
Afterwards.
Okay. The other thing to remember about narratives, the other thing that worries me about them, is that very often narratives can be a means of oppression. So small children hear their parents say things like, "You're always late." When a marriage is breaking down, the partners say to each other, "You never listen to me." Or, "You're always drunk, you always spend the money, you never spend time with the kids." Always, always, never, never. We tell stories about each other, and those stories that we tell about each other can be profoundly oppressive of each other. We put each other in a frame by means of our stories, and that frame can be and often is a prison. So that's another worry about narratives. Final thing I want to say about narratives, and this is beginning to work back towards a more positive view of them, many of the narratives that we care about are not actually individual narratives, and they're not actually permanent narratives. So Purun Das, Purun Bhagat, in Kipling's wonderful story, he cares about being an Indian civil servant for the Raj while he is, but then it's gone. Then it's dropped and it's over, and he moves on to something else. Or think about something that happens in spaces like this. Think about a theatrical production. As long as it's going on, there's a thing that we are trying to achieve together. But after the last night party, we'll move on to something else. Maybe we'll stop acting altogether. Maybe we'll be in a different production. We won't, one thing's for sure, ever be in this production before, ever be in this production again. And if you've ever done drama, this is one of the saddest things about it. The drama is so ephemeral. And you have this wonderful atmosphere, this esprit de corps built up around something that is so temporary. So narratives can be temporary, and narratives can be shared. And narratives can be oppressive. Those are all things to think about when thinking about narratives. But two of them are good. Narratives are temporary, narratives are shared, or can be good, because they shape some of the activities that we're involved in. Narratives can be oppressive, but also the flip side of that is narratives can be affirming. So you can say to the people around you, "You've always got time for me, haven't you? And what I love about you is you've always got a joke, no matter how badly things are going. You always have a joke. to keep us going, or the good stories we could tell about Barbie. Narratives can be oppressive, but they can also be liberating. If we see each other in a positive light, that's important to setting each other free in our social relations. And we can find ourselves part of someone else's narrative, or a larger unit's narrative, in a way which can be either good or bad. I'm thinking, for example, of something like Downton Abbey, or feudal relations in general. What's characteristic of feudal relations in general, and this is very obvious in Downton Abbey, is that most of the people below stairs, all the people below stairs, see themselves as there to serve the ends of someone else's narrative. That's what their life's meaning is. It's to serve someone else so that they can have a life narrative of their own. And what gets really subversive is when the servants stand up and say, well, no, actually, this is the narrative of my life. I want to live it my way, not your way. And this is why Figaro, Mozart's Figaro, is still such a profoundly subversive play, because that's exactly what Figaro and Susanna do. They say, we're not just here for the Count and the Countess, we're here for ourselves. We have our own lives to live, and we're not going to live at their beck and call. So we might now be getting towards the point that actually narratives are everywhere. I hope we're also getting towards another point I want to make, which is that we don't have to look for the narrative of a human life. And in a lot of things I've written, I talk about what I call the curse of the definite article. And this is where we put the into our philosophical questions, and it corrupts the question. What is the meaning of life? What is the reason why murder is bad? What is the reason that you have to get up in the morning? The curse of the definite article is in the word the, because the word the makes us look for a single answer. And in many cases, in many, many cases, there doesn't have to be a single answer. And that's even true in maths. When you're looking at a problem in algebra, what is the solution for this? Well, there might be two solutions at least, depending what kind of algebra it is. There might be a positive solution and a negative solution for a start. Even in maths, there isn't always the solution. Still less in philosophy, which is much messier and more chloroform than mathematics. So we shouldn't, I think, ask ourselves, what is the meaning of life? We should ask ourselves, what are the meanings of life? What are the possible meanings that our lives should have? And we shouldn't ask ourselves, what is the narrative of my life? We should ask ourselves, what narratives is my life fruitfully involved in? What narratives is it good for me to be part of? Perhaps a narrative involving a further distance when I'm gesticulating from the stand. What narratives is it good for me to be part of in order to make my life more genuinely human, more worth living, and more rich in possible meanings? Those are the questions to ask. And this is the very last thing I'm going to say, I want to trace this dialectical structure that I laid out some of for you by skipping around in the written text. I want to trace it back to a dichotomy that I find in our experience. I think when we introspect, when we look at ourselves, when we look at what it's like to be us, we find two different phenomena, both of which we might call the self. And they're both there inside of us. This isn't split personality or anything. I just mean that there's the me of the present moment. There's that experience when you wake up in the morning, and like putting on your clothes, you have to remember who you are. And it all comes back to you. Oh yes, I'm a philosophy professor, aren't I? And, oh yes, I'm going to Barnes this morning, aren't I? Better get up and get on the train. And oh yes, here's my partner in life, and here are my children, and here's the bedspread, and yes, it all comes back, and you kind of put the world back on. But you're a little point of consciousness at a particular time. That's you, under one understanding. But the other understanding of you is the you of memory. It's the you that you put on as you wake up in the morning and remember who you are and what you're doing with your life. Those two perspectives on who you are, one of them I think grounds a narrative understanding of ourselves. That's the memory aspect, where I think back over the story of my life, I think who I am and where I got to. And the other is the point of freedom, the existentialist self, the self that Sartre, for example, is really keen on. Because Sartre is all about forgetting about your facticité, forgetting about your past, and starting again anew from this particular moment. That gives you the freedom, and now I'm just going to quote Sartre because I think he's just right about this. Starting again from that particular moment gives you the freedom to do something new with your facticité, with your past, and not to be a slave of all the stuff you've done and all the stuff you've been, and of your narratives. You can give them a new twist. You can configure them in all sorts of surprising new ways just by waking up and thinking, yes, I'm free. I have this past, but it can help me. It doesn't have to be a prison for me. It can be a house that I can learn to live with, that I can learn to live in. And maybe, if necessary, that I can learn to redecorate, or even to knock a few walls down here and there, to change it round so that it suits who I want to be. So that's why my position is, as I called it at the beginning, a dialectical one. It's because the self, Strawson's absolutely right, the self is not just a narrative, but the proponents of narrative ethics are right, and Strawson is wrong, to think that the self is just this momentary, tiny point of consciousness moving through time. We have a past as well, and that's crucial to who we are. Both aspects are crucial, the narrative and the episodic, as Strawson calls it. So let's keep hold of both. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A fascinating talk. We have some time for questions. I might ask Paul or Robin's keen to skip around with the microphone. So do raise your hand if you have a question or a point you'd like to make. And while you have a think about that, I'll just ask a couple to get us started, if I may. You mentioned Sartre's existentialism and the importance of being able to start again.
Yeah.
And the idea of beginning, bringing a beginner's mind to things is also a key tenet of lots of Buddhist thinking, for example. To what extent do you think the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are a blessing, or to what extent do you think they're a curse? Where do you come down on that?
Well, this essay is going to appear in some form or other, I hope, if the editors will have it, in an essay, in a collection of essays on R.S. Murdoch. And one thing, Galen Strawson says Murdoch is an episodic being, and I can see what he means when I look at her novels. She does hop around a bit. But one thing she's very good at capturing is how the narratives that people tell about us can be a curse or a blessing, and how to be caught in someone else's web can be profoundly destructive. And I think that's a really important way in which the narratives that we tell about ourselves and others tell about us can enslave us and can trap us. And I think very often it's important to be able to get free of that. But they can be a blessing too. And as they are, for example, one thing that people do if they love each other is very often they say things about each other. They praise each other. They go out of their way to praise each other for their good qualities. And that can be, I'm making it sound a bit saccharine perhaps, but that can be very beautiful to watch when people do that. And it can be very affirming for both sides when this is done. And it's a good thing to do. There's another dimension, however, for the narratives that we construct about each other that's very important, that Murdoch is also very interested in, and that's whether those narratives are true. Murdoch talks a lot about just and loving attention to each other, and accuracy is part of what's needed there. And so the question is, what do you mean by true? It looks as if, suppose you have an array of dots, like the dots on these boards. I don't know if you can see them from the audience, but you can make up all sorts of shapes out of the dots on those boards. And it seems like any shape will be as good as any other. But there's some sense in which the narratives that we tell about each other can be true or false. And when someone has you in their power, as happens quite a lot in the world, they have you in their psychological power, and they're constructing a narrative about you which imprisons you. Often the reason why it imprisons is precisely because it's false. It's not true that you are. So, for example, a typical power move that people make: you are perpetually in my debt, I gave you all this, you're not even grateful, you haven't even said thank you, people say when they're trying to trick someone else or enslave them. And people get caught in these webs. People get caught and enslaved by that kind of psychological manipulation. And one of the key points that Murdoch wants to make about it is that it's not true when you do that. And I think there's a real question about what truth and falsity means here.
You also talked a little bit about the more simplistic versions of the narrative theory, the narrativity of ethics, around the need for a character to be consistent, you know, the Fagin approach. And I think that what we want to say around those cases is that the importance of character development, so moving beyond in some coherent way. But that seems to just beg the question of what direction do you want the story to go in?
Yes, and often coherence isn't even a necessary condition of a good development. It might be a good thing at times for your story to develop in an incoherent way, especially if what's true of you is that you've been oppressed, or you've been in a violently psychologically manipulative relationship or something like that, or if you suddenly realize something about yourself that you've always been suppressing. In a book of mine called Transfigured, drum roll, I talk about how it's possible for people to realize a thing about themselves that they've been very good at disguising from themselves, namely that they're transgender. That can happen in all sorts of ways with people in other areas, like being gay, or realizing that although you spent 50 years as a scientist, actually what you really want to do is paint, or realizing that you're in a marriage to someone and actually you've never loved them and you shouldn't be in that marriage, as happens to Dorothea Casaubon in Middlemarch. Moral progress isn't always tidy, and it isn't always coherent with what went before. There's a wonderful book by Laurie Paul called Transformative Experience, which I recommend to you, where Laurie Paul tries and constructs a decision theory approach to this kind of problem. If you're someone who wants to do ethics by numbers, how would you do the numbers about future preferences that you know that you will have, but which you don't now have? You're going to turn into a vampire, and when you turn into a vampire, you will have some preferences that you don't have now at all. You have no urge whatever to flat through the air and drink people's blood at present. But that's going to seem like a great idea when you're a vampire. How do you behave rationally now relative to that future, that known future fact about your own trajectory?
It's a dilemma. I love to open it up. It's a little bit dark, so please do wave vigorously if you have questions. Oh, conveniently, we've got two people next to each other. Thank you. Well
Ladies first.
Robin, whichever order you prefer.
Hello.
Oh, sorry, with this microphone, that one, you
Quite
speak
close.
right into it,
Quite
quite
close.
close.
That's it.
All right.
Okay, first and foremost to say thank you so much. Sophie was really, really great. Sorry, just to say it simple word. So I was fascinated. Actually, it's the first time I come to this group, and I thought I had to come because of the subject matter. And as I am a life coach, and one of the things that is kind of really fundamental to the success of the coaching experience is really around looking at our identity and our narrative and our past, and deciding, as in like intentionally deciding what aspects of the past serve our goals or our intentions for the future. And one of the most powerful exercises in that context is the one about rewriting your past, where you go past over your life narrative and you discern what bits of it serve you and what bits don't serve you. And there's also a big element of what is the truth, which you alluded to. So if you think about what happened to us 20 years ago, how now do we know what, I mean, was it even true then, or was it just a story that you created about that at that moment, which you kind of carried through, and that was part of the narrative, and you never even questioned it and got you where you are now, like almost like blindfolded? So I was wondering what your thoughts are around rewriting our story, rewriting our narrative on purpose.
Okay, thank you. That's a lovely question and such a rich one. I've been involved for about 13 years now with the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, and they recruited me in 2012 as an ethics expert. They wanted some insight from someone whose job is teaching ethics, which mine is, on the ethical foundations of their framework for practice. And I'm not a psychotherapist or counsellor in practice. I've been on the receiving end of it, but it's been wonderful for me to be involved with them as an ethicist and to learn more about the counselling professions. And I think one thing that I perhaps haven't emphasised enough in what I've said so far is the dark side of all this. And I mean two things about that in particular. One is that the truth about me might be dark, and the other is that it might not be easy or even possible for me to break the narratives that I'm trapped in. So on the first thought, I don't know if you know the wonderful Baz Luhrmann film Moulin Rouge, but there's a moment where Satine says to Christian, because she's trying to save Christian's life in a roundabout way by preventing the Duke from killing him by appearing to elope with the Duke. So Satine says to Christian, I am the courtesan and I choose the Maharaja, alluding to a silly plot for a musical that they're putting together within the musical. And she's saying, who I really am is that shallow, material girl, to quote Madonna's song. I am the person who just goes after the money. I don't have a soul. That's who I am really. Now, when she says it, it's quite untrue, as we discovered by the end of Moulin Rouge. But, I mean, without being too cynical about human nature, we might find out things about ourselves through life coaching or counselling or just through reflection. We might find things out about ourselves that we don't much like the look of. We're not all sweetness and light. We're not all lovely souls. I mean, we're all, as my college chaplain used to say in his Welsh accent, all the fellows of this college are wonderful human beings, potentially, but often potentially is a long, long journey. The other thing to say is that there can be forces in our lives that we really never get a grip of, we never control, we never overcome. And addiction is an obvious example. That's what addiction is all about. The struggle to overcome a propensity in yourself which you think is destructive and degrading, and maybe that's exactly right, maybe it is destructive and degrading, but you can't overcome it, you're trapped in it. And there are people who are trapped by their own addictions. And I said I was going to be dark. Unfortunately, I think it's true that we are fallible and that we are sometimes shallow and nasty. We're not all perfect human beings. We're not all lovely. Potentially might be a long journey. And sometimes we are genuinely trapped in things that we can't get out of. And that's tragic when it happens. But I think it would be a bit shallow of me to pretend that all problems are soluble.
Thank you. We had another question. Yes, great.
My question is, what is your definition of happiness?
My definition of happiness is, first of all, that I'm not convinced that neat little definitions, despite Socrates, I don't think that neat little definitions are always what we're after. I also think, to keep on batting away the question, I'll get to answering it in a minute. I think when Nietzsche wrote, man does not seek after happiness, only the Englishman does that. By the Englishman he means the utilitarian. Man can put up, Nietzsche says, this is from Twilight of the Idols, man can put up with almost any how, provided he has his why. And I think that's true. I think that what Nietzsche's saying there is what counts in life is having something that you care about, something that means something to you, and that if you have a project that counts for you, then that is what you are going to be invested in, and that is what is going to absorb your attention, and that is what is going to give your life meaning. And even if it also makes you miserable, or really unhappy, or poor, or uncomfortable, or puts you in pain, it's still going to be what gives your life meaning. So with all those qualifications aside, I think happiness can be defined either as having a life that is meaningful and worth living because it has a meaning, or it can be defined as the kind of thing that you feel when you open the curtains in the morning and it's a beautiful sunny day and the sunlight is bouncing off the tape and the air is sparkling with sunshine and Maytime joie de vivre. I think you can see sense in describing happiness as either of those two things, and the meaning account of happiness goes with the narrative self, and the sunlight bouncing off the tape. This happens to me. We're lucky we can see the river from our bedroom window, and I am never ever going to move to somewhere after this that doesn't have a sea view. I can sit up in my bed and see the sea. How great is that? The momentary bits of happiness goes with the punctual view of the self, and I've been wanting to say in this talk that there's something to both of those. So there you are. You asked for a definition of happiness, and I gave you two. Both of them unsatisfactory.
Excellent. Do we have? Yes, we've got one on the right.
Thank you. From what I gathered, your conclusion was that we should try and live multiple narratives. But to use your own example of the Parisian, he has to choose the narrative between fighting for his country and saving his mother. And you denounced utilitarians for trying to measure up the options and picking it that way. So what should people do when they can't live two narratives at once and they have to choose one? Or is there any way to make the choice at all and they should do it randomly?
Well, I don't think tossing a coin would be any better than trying to tot up in two columns the goods, the reasons for and against doing something. Actually, I think totting up in two columns the reasons for and against something might be a better way to go. There's an example of that in Charles Darwin, when Charles Darwin was trying to decide whether to marry or not. I discussed this at the beginning, drum roll, of knowing what to do. I think we're always being drawn into superficial and oversimplified ways of making decisions. Because they're portable, we can carry them around with us and apply them to any decision. But they'll apply well to some decisions. I mean, there are decisions for which tossing a coin is a perfectly fair way to make a decision. That's how we decide which end we're playing from. That's how we decide who bats first. That's fine. There are decisions where tossing a coin is just the thing to do. But what I want to say, what I fundamentally want to say, is two things. First of all, different decisions deserve different ways of making them. So second, there isn't any one way of making decisions which is the right way to make any decision. But also thirdly, and this is the pessimistic bit, it isn't true that for any decision there is a satisfactory way of making it. There are decisions where there's just no good answer to the problem. And Sartre thought that was true of the young man trying to choose between his aged mother and the Free French. pick your own examples from your own lives, because we will, probably most of us come across such decisions. And I think in philosophy we're very prone to think, there must be an answer, and it's not satisfactory unless we find an answer. And I want to question that assumption that there always is an answer.
Thank you. We have one down here on my left, Robin in the outside. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a super interesting talk. I feel I might take you away from what we've been here to talk about, but I feel compelled to ask you. So, excuse me. As a professional philosopher and someone as erudite as yourself, I'd love to hear what you think about death. So, it strikes me the ethics conversation is leading to a discussion around what we're here for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, given your knowledge and all the stuff you've clearly thought about throughout your career, where do you sort of stand on what's it all for, given what you've learned about ethics and your discussion about narrative?
Thank you. Gosh, what a large question.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Christian myself, so I think for people who are Christians, there is a sense in which you do what you do because you're working towards someone who other people don't necessarily see. You're concerned with pleasing someone of whom others are not necessarily aware. And it's like a friendship or a love relationship. It's not well described as a servant-master relationship. There's a lot of that rhetoric in religious traditions, but I think it is more about friendship. So, as a Christian, there's that side to things. Alongside that, whether or not one has any religious beliefs, I think that a lot of the things that we do don't need any validation beyond themselves. I think a lot of the things that we do are worthwhile in and of themselves. And that perhaps is an episodic kind of thought. Because suppose you're good at the piano, which I'm not. I play the piano, but I'm dreadful. But suppose you're good at the piano and you sit down, there's one of those people's pianos in the railway station, you have 20 minutes before the train goes, you've just got time to sit down and play a Bach prelude. And unlike me, you can actually play the difficult ones and not just the first prelude. So you can pick your prelude, or you can play a Chopin nocturne. I'd love to be able to play the nocturnes. I'm nowhere near. But you sit down and you play that, you close the piano lid, you get up and go and catch a train. I think this is one of the main things that art is for, actually. I think that is, if you like, a dollop of existential meaning, right there in the middle of the world, all on its own, that needs no support whatever from anything else. And it would still have the same meaning whether or not God existed. It would still have the same meaning whether or not the rest of your life was a disaster and a meaningless swamp of unhappiness. There'd still be this moment where you played the 21st Nocturne perfectly on a beautiful sunny morning on the people's piano and then got up and walked away. I think that kind of thing is, as much as anything, the meaning of life. So what's it all for? It's all for moments like that. That's one answer. It's not the answer I'm restricting myself to. I think there are other answers as well. But that would be enough, even if it was the only thing we had.
Thank you very much. We've got time for one more, I think. I can just see one at the back. Getting some good exercise today, Robert. Done a ladder earlier.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I agree with your conclusions. Completely as can. But I want to take you back to the beginning where you describe Aristotle and King Priam, who doesn't have a happy life because it ends badly. And I wonder, happy seems like the wrong word. What would Aristotle have said if Priam's life has started horribly and ended well? Would that be a happy life or still a miserable one? because I think happy is a sort of internal thing, not an externally imposed judgment. But
Right.
maybe that's misunderstanding the Greek word.
Right. Well, the word eudaimon and the adjective and the corresponding noun eudaimonia, which is usually translated happy and happiness, it literally means having a good guardian spirit. A daimon, a demon in English. Christian polemicists made a lot of that in the first 3 centuries of the church. Socrates had a demon. A daimon is a tutelary spirit. It looks after you. It keeps your luck good. You have eudaimonia if your tutelary spirit is kind to you. So I hope you can see why that's already leading us towards what I call the verdictive account of happiness in Aristotle. Because a tutelary spirit that looks after you well will ensure that your life has a good ending. And yes, you're right, therefore, happiness is not quite the word for it, but happiness is the word that we generally use, and I think it's misleading because it makes us think about, pleasure levels, and it makes us think about whether I'm satisfied right now, and it makes us think even about, having a flourishing life like Priam has until things go wrong. Actually, Aristotle has a different word for that kind of flourishing. Eudaimonia, contrary to lots of the literature, is not the Greek for flourishing. The Greek for flourishing is euthene, a different word which Aristotle rarely uses. I said there wouldn't be any Greek. Sorry, that's Greek. Throw in some logic next. I've already thrown in P. So the other thing I wanted to say in answer was that there's a big literature on the shape of a life in philosophy, and in the draft state of this paper, right at the end of the draft, I've actually got a whole bunch of bibliography that I haven't got round to looking into properly. Here's some of it. Various people have written about the shape of a life, and I talk about this, and I'm going to see if I can name check every single one of my books in this talk. In my first ethics monograph, Understanding Human Goods in 1998, I talked about this, about the shape of a life, and the way Dickens' life, for example, was a better life than one that went the other way, because Dickens started in miserable penury in the debtor's prison, and working as a bootblack, and ended up as a very successful novelist, as we know. But that's a good life. A life that goes from wealth to poverty might well be a much worse life than that, unless it's the life of Purim Begat, who chose poverty.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to... Oh, Robin. Yes, go on then. It's Robin's question.
Sorry,
Just
guys.
got a minute, Robin.
A very quick one. Book 7 of the Ethics, yeah? Excesses, means, and deficiencies. Does that fit into any dialectic pattern? Does it fit into fascism versus asceticism? Or is that his way of rationalizing what is the best? Or is it simply a way of describing the good and the dark?
The good and the what, sorry?
The good and the dark that you mentioned, the dark side.
So we're thinking about akrasia here?
Yeah, excesses mean, yes, akrasia.
Yeah.
Excesses, means, and deficiencies.
So what's going on in Book 7 is Aristotle's talking about states like addiction, like I was a minute ago. And yes, it is an exploration of the dark side. And Aristotle's trying to explain a problem that bothered Socrates too. The problem of how you can know that something is a bad thing to do and yet go ahead and do it. A lot of the time we are obscure to ourselves. We behave in ways that we don't understand. And one of the great things about counselling or life coaching is that sometimes it can shed light on why we do these things, and sometimes the truth sets us free. Sometimes it helps us to live better, that we understand why we're wired the way we are. And I can tell you that certainly happens if you're transgender. Name checking yet another book of mine. The first book I ever wrote was Aristotle and Augustine on free will, and that was 1995, and that was an upgrade of my thesis. And the reason why I wrote a PhD about free will and akrasia, and this book 7 of an Iconic Ethics problem, was precisely because there were things about myself that I couldn't figure out. It was to some extent, the book doesn't look it looks very textual and technical, but to some extent it was autobiographical. I was trying to understand why in my own
But you use
case,
it as a tool.
yeah,
Yeah.
why in my own case, I thought I should do this and I went ahead and did that. So much at the time.
Thank you. We are going to have to stop there, but please do.